You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
We here at Saving Elephants are all about trying to understand what is going so wrong in our politics, how it might be reformed so that it's more responsive and representative. I'm your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me in this episode is Jeff Mayhugh. He is the founding editor of Politics and Parenting and vice president of the Uncap Fund, which is an organization that advocates for congressional reform by removing the cap of 435 members of the United States House as a means of addressing many of the problems we have in our politics. Jeff reminds me of that politician who manages to get his talking points in on his agenda no matter what question the press asks him. He really has honed that skill well, showing how so many of the hang-ups we have in our political discourse can in a lot of ways be attributed to this seemingly unimportant and mundane issue of how many members are there in the United States House. But Jeff is no politician. He is a concerned citizen who, in my view, is extremely well-read and well-spoken, who has a persuasive message that has a broad appeal. I mean, he's been on shows like Matt Lewis in the News and Timcast IRL with Tim Pool, and just about everywhere else in between, sharing this message of how getting back to the roots of what the founders believed about representation and unleashing the House so that its members are more responsive to the citizens and not just the political class and the elite is a reform we can all get behind because it benefits all of us as Americans. Well, I think he makes a pretty persuasive case, but I'll leave that for you to decide. I'm going to give you now my conversation with Jeff Mayhugh.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Jeff, one of your recent posts in Substack that caught my attention was about learned helplessness, and possibly because I had just recently ran across the subject myself and found it interesting from a personal dynamic standpoint. But you apply this concept of learned helplessness, the basic idea that if we fail at a few things, eventually we just sort of presume we're going to fail and just give up trying. And this was demonstrated very effectively, I think, in a classroom of giving a class tests, but they were actually two separate tests, not telling the class that there were two separate tests. One of those tests was completely unsolvable. The other one was relatively easily solvable. And then the last question was identical. But wouldn't you know it, the first set that got the unsolvable test, by the time they get to that last question, they just gave up, whereas the other side of the room that had been solving the test the whole time, they did quite well. And I think this demonstrates this sort of human capacity for learned helplessness. You use this as an idea for, and I think we can probably all relate to this in this moment we're in our politics. We're stuck. We're cynical. There's no point to this. And you write truth. The truth is growth is absolutely possible. It takes understanding. It takes effort. It takes people building something together. I think that's true. However, I want to start off here because we're recording. I don't know when it'll be released, but we're recording around the same time that Elon Musk is fleeing Washington, D.C., having shown up with, much accolades. A lot of my friends that were super pro-Trump were just pumped about Elon Musk. Here's this genius that's finally going to set everything straight. And of course, we had high hopes for this guy. Billions and trillions we're going to be saving. And now it seemed like he's kind of leaving with sort of almost a reverse of this, right? He didn't show up with learned helplessness. He knew he would fix the problem, and now he's leaving. So I'm wondering, can we start here? What is that happy median? We all want reform in government. But how do we strike a balance between the cynicism of we can't do this versus the sort of blind ignorance of, well, the stupid people are in charge. If you just put me in charge, I can fix it all.
I think it starts with, where is the reform coming from? Is it coming from a small group or individual from the top dictating to us? Or is it coming from a consensus of debate from the bottom building something up? Right? And I think what you see with Doge is the first one. It's a small group, an individual making the decisions for others. And ultimately, how are you supposed to encompass all the different interests and factions and people's opinions into that reform? And if you're not going to take in everybody's opinions, then what are you reforming and who are you reforming it for? Ultimately, people don't really feel represented in the government. And, having 5 people or 10 people or whatever try to fix that problem isn't representing them. It's just doing something. And I think we do need to do something. And I understand why people would get excited about somebody doing something. But ultimately, like, if you're going to get over learned helplessness, then you need to you need to be able to do it yourself, right? Like that's the crux of what my article was about is like, look, you just have to put the work in yourself. You have to take initiative. And we're a self-government. If we're going to reform, it has to come from the people. It can't come from the elite.
So I'm loath to get here too terribly early, but I think it needs to be asked right up front. What does that functionally look like? I think we know what putting the one guy in charge, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. We've tried this model. We all know what this model looks like. What does it functionally look like to do the opposite? Because presumably you're not talking about an Athenian style, every dude gets an equal vote and hand in government.
No, our founders tried to find a balance between that, right? And so we as citizens vest our power into representation in the House of Representatives, right? It's the bicameral Congress balancing the power between the aristocracy and the people, the king and the people, right? The ones that are going to profit from it and the ones who are kind of doing the work to make it what it is. And it gives them power. So you have the Senate, which represents the states, it represents the aristocracy, it represents the union, and then you have the people, which is a deeper level of representation for actual citizens away from that aristocracy, away from wealth, away from, those concentrated forms of power. And we just haven't grown our representation, right? People just don't have a fair voice, as you know, and I'll bring up if any that haven't heard, the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, right? And what this did is it capped the House of Representatives at 435. Prior to that, every 10 years we would have a census. And after that, as the population grew, we would apportion more representatives. So people had power. Every time the population grew, we grew power for the people as well. But after 1929, in this Permanent Apportionment Act, we decided to stop growing our power. But we didn't stop growing as a nation. The government kept getting bigger. The country kept getting bigger. The population kept growing. And therefore, the people's power remained the same. And their voices got drowned out, got diluted. We have to, I think the first step is people need to understand this. Like, so I work for No Cap Fund, right? Our mission is to uncap the House of Representatives. And the first step of doing that is getting people to get past learned helplessness to understand that, yes, things can change. And then to educate them and let them know that they can actually do it. Like you can make this change yourself simply by asking the right questions and talking about the right thing. And the right thing is representation, right? You need representation as a citizen to have a voice in your government. And right now you don't have it and you probably aren't aware of it. But here's some information that can help you. And if you start talking about this and we all start talking about this, then the people in charge will start talking about it. And once that happens, it'll happen.
I know that you spend a lot of time going to various political organizations, functions, events. You've mentioned that you've attended Democratic events, MAGA events, Never Trumper events. I feel like I've talked to you enough and read enough of your stuff. I've got I'll say, a broad sense of where I might be able to peg you ideologically. That being said, is this a message that you are hopeful and believe has I'll say, outside our typical red versus blue ideological fights appeal? Is this something that you think, in theory, could and should appeal to a populist, to someone who's pro-Trump, anti-Trump, to a Democrat, to a Republican?
Yeah, absolutely. The key thing is like everybody has interest and everybody wants power. They want to be able to make the decisions over their own lives. Every single person in this country does. And they may or may not think of it that way until their interests are threatened or their power is threatened. And once they realize that, then they're loath to grab it, right? And this is something that gives people power. People feel powerless in their government. They feel like they can't, like I said, learned helplessness. People don't feel things can change. When I got into this, I started knocking doors in 2021 for the governor's race in Virginia for Glenn Youngkin. And they give you a list of questions to like ask, and they're very bland and they don't really do anything. So I came up with my own list of questions. And my first list of questions is like, what do you think about the government? and everybody hated it. Republican, Democrat, didn't matter what it was. They complained about it, and then they pointed the finger at the other side. And then the next question was, do you think it can get better? And almost universally, everybody was like, no, it can't get better.
Hmm.
And then, I start talking about like uncapping the house and doing all these different things, and people start to go, well, maybe that could work. And it's like, well, you thought it couldn't get better when you didn't think there was a plan to fix it and you didn't think there was an idea to fix it. But once you hear this idea, now your mind has changed just a little bit. Now you're like, okay, well, I hadn't heard this thing before. Now it's new. It's now you have to take a new perspective on an old problem. And when you take a new perspective on an old problem, now you have a fresh start. And when you have a fresh start, you can make some change.
I'm suspicious that some of what is leading individuals to presume it cannot get better is the tribalistic mindset that what is preventing real reform is the other guy, right? The other side. That you go to MAGA America and they're ready with the answers of what the left is doing to destroy the country. Same with the left. And I talk about this very often on this podcast. I have no idea how, but at one point in my life, I was getting mailers from both the Republican and Democratic national committees. And it blew my mind when I would get these same letters that are always written for the lowest common denominator voter, that they were basically the exact same letter. They just used different buzzwords. And it's like there's no thought, there's no debate, there's no argument, there's no moral or ethical or political or sociological argument here. It's literally, this makes me feel good, this like makes me feel bad. By the way, we need a minimum $18 to process your survey so that we can, tell your representative essentially how we're going to run the government. And the questions were things at the time, I'm dating myself, but like, do you support George W. Bush's efforts to help children? And literally at the end of it, it would ask something to the effect of, would you mind contributing $18? Or you could check, no, I prefer liberal Democrats to run the country. And it just seems like this sort of checkbox approach is in the... most of the people I encounter are way more sophisticated and intelligent than that, but it seems like there's something about politics where our brain just shuts off, and that's how we presume things work, is this sort of yes-no checkbox.
I mean, I think it's a couple different things. One, it's a strategy, right? If you want people to vote for your ideas, you need to kind of like get them to your ideas. And that starts with simple communications. That's where you get that bland, short stuff, right? But the other part of it is they want you to vote for what they want you to vote for. So they're also trying to like shield you from other information by only giving you certain information. And it's your job as a citizen to like be well read, to listen to other medias, to listen to other politicians out there. And then, like, at the end of the day is like, again, it doesn't matter what they say. If you understand where your power is and you talk about it, they will be forced to talk about it because there's far fewer of them than there are of us, meaning, far fewer representatives versus people that need representation. And, all it takes is, again, just having the right conversations. And, you know, sometimes having the right conversations means you have to be confident about it. Like I tell my kids, if you want to be part of the conversation, you have to know what it's about. Otherwise, you can't just walk in and start talking. You need to find a way into the conversation, and that starts with education. And I think average Americans kind of look at this idea of representation or uncapping the House, and they might think, "I don't understand it. It's too complicated. I can't do it. It can never happen." And I push back and I go, realistically, I didn't know any of this 5 years ago. Personally, I took a journey of education through I've read 37 books this year. I read 100 pages per day. I've been doing that since 2021, 2020-ish, and I've become highly educated in this specific area because of this. But I also know that in order to do that, I had to give up, because I subbed reading in for I dropped fantasy football. I quit drinking alcohol because alcohol was expensive and books are expensive, and I had to pick one, right? I quit playing flag football. I quit some other hobbies too, and I made this my focus. Now, every American doesn't have to quit that many things, right? But most American, especially men, I'll speak from that because I'm a man and I know what men do, is, they play in a fantasy football league. Maybe they have like a hobby where they're like doing woodworking on the side or smoking meat or something. Those are all things that I did. And it's like, okay, cool. Take 6 months, give that time up for 6 months, play one less fantasy football league. The time that you spend educating yourself about fantasy football for that league, you can spend educating yourself on error representation. And if you think you can't understand it, you're wrong. You can understand it because fantasy football in a lot of ways is far more complex than representation. And if you can understand fantasy football, then you can absolutely understand representation. Average citizens are incredibly intelligent and capable of learning anything they want to learn, but they have to want to learn it and they have to carve out time to learn it. And they just have to make a choice. Do you want this to be a government of the people that's self-governing? Or do you want to be governed and ruled and told what to do? And at the end of the day, I think if people are pushed with that question, they're going to put down their hobby for a minute. They're going to learn the thing that they need to do to keep their freedom, because ultimately that's where our freedom lives. It lives in representation. That's where self-government it lives. And so it's just a matter of giving people another option. Right now, I just don't think they feel like they have another option, and they're kind of stuck in this battle of pointing fingers at that side or that side.
The structure our founders bequeathed us is, I think, predicated very much on the notion that we Americans would be self-educated, right? That we would take some sort of ownership of self-government. Obviously, at a nation of 330 million people, you can have a lot of people sitting on their laurels not doing that, but we can't all do that. We're simply not going to work. And that's part of what, in effect, Saving Elephants is all about. Is I recognize that most people are not going to be spending their evenings reading Burke. So I try to, and I try my best to faithfully convey, and especially through guests, okay, here's what he said, here's the main points. And then every once in a while, I'm hoping somebody will listen to someone such as yourself, this passion you have for this specific issue, very important, that will say, okay, that's what I want to hitch my wagon to. And maybe I don't have nearly as much time as Jeff to do the reading, but I get that he's part of the organization doing this, and I can pour some of my time into that. So that being said, I think it's necessary then that we sketch out a little bit of and I'm sure you've heard them all before, some of the critiques of these ideas. But before we get there, I want to just ask about, you mentioned 1929 was when this cap took place. Why did it take place? Was it a good idea, bad idea at the time? And what was the history? What's going on there? And I'll even ask, prior to 1929, was it a simple matter of the House had always faithfully expanded via the once every 7-year consensus, or were there other periods of time in our history where we extracted or expanded the House based on something other than that?
So representation has always been a point of contention in America. From the founding, that's how we got the bicameral Congress, is because the Articles of Confederation weren't working. The states were not representing the people. The executive branch didn't have enough power, so we redid our Constitution. After that, you had the issue with representation, the three-fifths clause, right? Because you had people that were not considered people, they were considered slaves, and yet the people that owned those people were then given more power in Congress. So it tipped the balance of representation. It tipped the balance of power in the government, and everybody's like, how do we go from a country fighting a revolution on freedom to fighting the Civil War to free slaves? Well, the answer is we gave extra power to the slaveholders, and they didn't want to let it go, right? And they didn't just use it to keep their slaves; they used it to empower themselves and enrich themselves in the Southern government,
And
right?
it should be stressed, up until the push of the Civil War itself, the South very much was trying to expand its cultural influence and its territory within the geographic United States.
Absolutely, and they wanted to undo something like the Missouri Compromise so they can
Yeah.
continue to have an outsized power in the House of Representatives, right? So representation is always going to be the battleground. If you look in all of history, any type of big issue, representation is typically the center of it. It's the idea of who gets to be in power, the people that want to be in power or all the people, right? And so if you fast forward after the Civil War and we started to balance representation, we had rapid growth in population, we had rapid growth in wealth, we had rapid growth in the House, and we were growing exponentially. And people were moving from rural areas to urban areas more than ever before. And after the 1920 census, for the first time in American history, more people lived in urban areas than rural areas, right? World War II was going on. There was a whole bunch of people out of the country. People were it was taken during, I think, the winter time. So people had moved from the rural areas to the urban areas to get jobs, during this time period. And what was presented was a continuing growing house, which they were struggling to manage the house at the time. And you had this displacement of power. States were going to lose representation and it was going to go to other states. And, you know, certain areas of states were going to gain representation or lose representation. So you had this battle from 1920 to 1929 about what the apportionment was going to be. Some people just didn't want to apportion more power to the people anymore. They didn't want to continue to expand the House for various reasons. There was issues over who do we count as people, right? It's because it's still all persons. There was a major influx of immigration during this period of time, which meant that let's say you're Carnegie, right? And you own the steel mills, right? You want power. You've got a state that is restricting you from doing what you want. All right. So here's what you can do. You can build a steel mill, you can bring a whole bunch of people from a different country into that town, and now you've increased the population. Then you can make all those people vote for who you want them to vote for, even though they're not necessarily supposed to vote because they're not citizens yet. Or even if they're not voting, you just have to put them there so it moves the representation to you and the power to you.
Because the consensus dictates that the House would have more representation in that area.
Right, and then you can essentially prop up somebody. You can say, "Okay, here it is," and then it's easier for them to stay in that position because you have the population to support it. As the population would move or shift, you might lose that representative, but by increasing the population, you guarantee that that representative stays in their position, and therefore, if you're the one paying that representative to be in their job by donating to their campaigns, then you are gonna continue to increase the population. So you have all these different factors going on to consider of what was happening to the country. Power was being moved around in different places. New powers like corporations were rising and taking more power than they had before, right? And so they just couldn't decide. There's lots of different arguments for and against in the congressional record from 1920 to 1929. But ultimately, was it a good decision or was it a bad decision? What I'll say is I try not to judge the people in the past. They made the best decision they could think of in the time, right? They had other issues that they were dealing with that they were trying to solve. And has it been bad for our country? Yes, it has been. Could they have written it differently? Yes. But at any point in time, any other Congress could have taken this issue up and fixed it. But we're not paying attention to it, right? I think which is, maybe there should have been a sunset clause on that permanent appropriation. Nothing should ever be permanent in government, right? Except for the Constitution, except for the amendments. Everything else should just be, and even an amendment can be repealed, right? If you get a consensus. And I think that, they didn't make a bad decision or a good decision per se. They just made the decision that was in their best interest, right? And in their best interest is preserving and expanding the union in the present. And our interest, we have to the future, which is us, we have to represent our interest. And this is in our interest now.
Why do you think then that, I mean, 1929 was a long time ago. And if it was not necessarily the habit of the United States to get absolutely stuck in these models, like I understand there's some inertia, say, with picking up an issue of this nature, but is it the same arguments that would have been in the culture at the time? Like, well, expanding the House just sounds like giving more power to the politicians. Like, why do we go from 1929 up until today? And it just never occurred to large swaths of the American people, hey, this is messing us up.
And I don't know if there is a way to answer that question honestly. I think there's so many different variables that go into that we will never really know. But I think the biggest thing is just people didn't know about it, right? It's just like if you don't it gets lost. There's so much that goes in, and everybody is, like I said, fighting for their interests, fighting for the power, trying to get things done, trying to solve different problems that come up. I mean, if you think about it, after 1929, what happened? Right, the market crashed. Right, you had the Great Depression, then you had World War II, then you had Vietnam. Right, then you had the malaise of the 70s and all of that, and then things start to change and pick up. So in all of these different circumstances and the periods of time, there are good and bad things that are happening. And your government overall is functioning well. The United States government has functioned well. It is, it's not perfect. It's made mistakes, but if you read other governments and other history, like you read the Cultural Revolution of China, you read the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, you read all these different things, and like really bad things happen in other countries. Yet America has been able to protect itself and protect its people, I think, better than any other country. There hasn't been large mass genocides here in the last 100 plus years, 200 years ever, really, and that's different. And so I think that people just become content. They say it's working and they don't understand why it's working and they just move on. And I think the other point of why that happens is because of education. We shifted our education system right around the time that we banned the Apportionment Act. And a lot of these things have to do with race relations and controlling information and stuff like that. But the crux of it was just about kind of shaping America citizens where they thought they needed to be. Look at even at our modern day education, the shift from like traditional education to like STEM education. It's like, okay, well, computers are going to be really important. We need to push this in schools. We need to get kids thinking about this. And it's like, that's great. I don't disagree with that in an overall principle. People do need to be educated in this concept. However, we can't forget about the other things like government, basic civics. We just do not spend enough time in education on basic civics.
Do you have strong opinions on John Dewey?
I do not have strong opinions on John Dewey.
You don't? Okay. Wow. Wow.
I'm not wildly familiar with him, to be fair. So
you were starting to go down the education route, and way back in the early days of this podcast, John Dewey and especially Rousseau, there was hardly an episode that went by that we didn't blame something on him. Nowadays, it tends to be more Woodrow Wilson. But yeah, he I think part of what you're describing, and maybe it's not fair to say certainly with the STEM field, but this whole entire notion of education becomes a tool of the state to try to get the citizen to be, a citizen of the future. In effect, is very Dewey-esque, if you will, and kind of detaching it from the more traditional classical aspects of education, and what I would argue is a more founder's education vision. But that's I'll give you a chance to read that a lot of Dewey books, and then we'll have you back on for that conversation. See if you're pro or anti Dewey. But I wanted to ask. I mentioned I evoked Woodrow Wilson's name. I know the time period doesn't line up here, and it's probably not fair for me to blame him for too much of this. But that era, 1920s through 29, it's not all him. I mean, we got Herbert Hoover in there, but I think it is fair to say this is the sort of the progressive era in effect. How much of this, because I know a lot of the capital P progressive era was all about fixing, I'm putting scare quotes around fixing government, right? The founders, yeah, they had a pretty good idea, but that was antiquated. We have advanced as a species. Science has helped us in so many ways technologically. Why couldn't we apply these same principles to the human machine and try to understand how to develop politics in ways? Why not just give it to the experts to let them solve the problem of politics? And I know that in that comes a lot of, and again, air quotes, reforms that make government work. In other words, the way the founders set it up, it doesn't work real well. You have to have too much consensus, and that's messy, and it takes a lot of time. But if we get the professional class in charge and invest more power in central authority, such as the president, if we minimize the role of Congress, this can actually it's a more I will grant it's a more productive government, right? At least at first. Nowadays one might be able to argue it's quite the opposite. But I guess I'm asking this, like, how much of Wilsonian thinking do you believe is either not only still with us today, but even since 1929 has prevented real reform in this effort?
a lot of it, I think it's a big issue. It's the way that people perceive their government and what their role and responsibility is in their government. And the Wilsonian philosophy of government was exactly as you described it. It was a small group of elite telling other people what to do, and that made it function better. It made it work, depending on how you consider that word defined, work better because it's more efficient. You can get more done. You can solve these problems that you're having. And it shifted the way that people think about it. Now, if there's a problem with your government, you're looking up at the president and you're going, it's his fault, or it's, or it's his, if there's a good thing, it's his, you're either the hero or the villain if you're
He
the
gets
president.
the credit and the blame.
The credit and the blame. But the reality is we're not supposed to look to the president, right? We're supposed to look to Congress. We're supposed to look to our congressional representatives, and we're not supposed to look to somebody else to do the job for us. We're supposed to do the job. It's our government. It's our responsibility. And I think the Wilsonian theory says, hey, everybody just sit back and don't worry about it. I think a great example to this would be, have you ever watched The Simpsons? I mean, everybody's watched The Simpsons, right?
Not as much as some, but yes, I've watched.
Okay. So there's this great episode in The Simpsons that I loved as a kid where Homer runs to be the sanitation commissioner because him and Marge have an argument about taking out the trash. There's a big thing. He doesn't like the way it's being done. So he runs for sanitation commissioner. And his entire campaign is, can't somebody else do it? And he basically promises everything under the sun, this big government bureaucracy of trash man can. The trash man can. And what the trash man can do is everything that he said to do, except he forgot about the basics. He forgot about actually functioning the government, right? Where is the trash going to go? Where is it going to be stored? He didn't take care of any of this stuff. And overall, he ends up orchestrating with the mob to bury the trash underneath the Springfield. It destroys the town and they have to move 10 miles down the road. Well, it's very similar to what's happened, right? It's you have a centralized government that promises you a lot of stuff, okay, but it's not taking care of the basics. They're not paying our bills. They're not writing immigration reform, and there's a lot of trash floating around. Like that's the whole Doge thing. Is like, let's get rid of fraud, waste, and abuse, and let's use this small group of people to do it. But it's not their job. It's our job, right? And like we have to take that responsibility back, or we have to ask. Take it back. Take it back is a quote violent term. I would say we need to ask for it back. Like we need to talk about it. We need to explain it and be like, hey, I understand that you guys have been doing this job for 100 plus years, and overall, you guys have done a good job. But right now, I think you're overworked and overwhelmed. Why don't you let us take a little bit of that pressure off of you? Let us shoulder a little bit of the responsibility.
So, and part of the reason I'm asking about this Wilsonian model is not just because I want to blame everything on him, although that is, he or Rousseau, take your pick. I also recognize that while your message has the potential to appeal to most Americans, regardless of which party they vote for, it is also necessarily anti-certain ideas on the left, on the collectivist left. It is necessarily, I would argue, a Madisonian vision of what representation looks like, and not a Saul Alinsky or a Bernie Sanders. When Sanders was running for president, he and maybe he's done it for 40 years for all I know, but he started this whole notion of we should have, people who are incarcerated need the right to vote. Why should the fact that they're behind bars deprive them of their presumably natural right to have a say in the election? And Kamala Harris, who at the time was also running and never heard a bad idea she didn't want to disagree with, said, "Yeah, I think it's time we look into this." Which is the most non-answer I think a politician can get. It's time to have this conversation. What does that even mean? Anyhow, I think though, for Sanders' credit, that is a faithful translation of an central idea of the left that we individuals are all equal representations within this broader cog of the collective, right? That we all have an equal voice, and it doesn't matter if we're incarcerated. Whereas oftentimes on the right, and rightly so, it gets criticized, it's a little bit more icky. Sometimes the Burkean idea of representation is, you may not get a vote. Or as Russell Kirk put it, we have a right not to govern, but to be governed well. And by which he wasn't talking about self-government. What he meant was rather it's not the right, I shouldn't say the right. Traditional Madisonian conservatism, so far as I can tell, does not think of the person as an individual equal cog within the system. Rather, the individual is a complex living organism that true representation is not just who they get to vote for, but the way they express themselves and live within the cacophony of communities that they inhabit. And so therefore, it necessarily, our politics are going to be imperfect. There is no way we can truly sketch out every person gets an equal say in government. But we can consistently move toward perfection. We can consistently try to reform to understand this better, because Madison was not arguing for Athenian, every guy gets an equal vote. He obviously wasn't arguing for centralized authority. Neither are a lot of the left, but they're also, I think, have two very different depictions of what representation means.
I think there definitely is this more democratic view of representation on the left than there is on the right. But I think that our system is set up to balance those two visions, right? Like that's the whole point is like, look, we can't give everybody an equal vote because look, let's be real. Everybody's not equal, okay? Like if you go out and you commit a crime, you are no longer equal to your citizen. You've committed something that society has deemed to lock you away, right? Like you want to have a separate argument about whether that person should be able to vote. Okay, I'll have that argument with you. But like we have to recognize that person is no longer equal to every average citizen, right? They are different. And, we all have different strengths and weaknesses. And our system tries to balance all those different strengths and weaknesses. And to your point about representation, it's not necessarily just your vote, but it is the ability to go speak with somebody in the government about something, whether you have a problem or whether you just want to understand. I think a lot of our problem in for us is like we don't understand what's going on because we're educated by the media and the different interest groups. They're the one communicating with us because we can't actually talk directly to our representative. because they represent too many different people, right? If those groups are smaller, if the districts are smaller, if the representative had less people to communicate with, we would actually be able to have a conversation. They would actually be able to educate us on what's really going on and what they're trying to work on without having to work through a different medium like the media or social media, right? And we would, if you can, it's kind of like, it's like a marriage, right? Like you got to be able to communicate with your partner. Okay. You got to be able to disagree with your partner and come to some sort of conclusion or compromise to move forward. If you are talking directly to your partner, if you're speaking through somebody else, how good is your communication? What is getting through and what isn't getting through? And I think that's a really important concept to understand when you're talking about representation and making sure you have a government that is for and by the people.
So one of the another planks, I guess, of saving elephants, um, and I'm grateful that this is an idea that seems to be emerging in stronger force, at least on the right today, is the notion that Congress sucks. It's not doing its job, right? That part of the problem, when I was younger, it was all about the problem is the courts and the president are taking too much power. Now it seems to almost be reversed. It's like, well, yeah, but what else are they supposed to do? Congress is literally not doing the job the Constitution makes very clear is its job. Why would we expect the president and the courts to do anything else? And so I am a huge advocate of trying to find the various means by which we can get Congress to simply do its job. And I'm curious here to what degree, I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm kind of curious here to what degree uncapping the House would or would not change this. Because to me, if we uncap the House and we go from 435 members of the House of Representatives to, I don't know, 500, 5,000, whatever number you want to throw out there, is that going to have a notice? Let me put it this way. Are we dealing with two separate problems? One is the lack of representation. The other is we've not yet found a way to truly incentivize the average representative to do the job that Congress or the Constitution has mandated to them. Or does one necessarily fix the other or get at fixing the other? In other words, would uncapping the House somehow cause Congress to reassert its role as the center of our government?
Both, realistically. It's a step in the right direction, right? So uncapping the House re-incentivizes people because it gives people power. It opens up new opportunities for people out there who want to reform the House. The only people who don't want to reform the House are the people that are currently in the House, right? And if you uncap the House, and I understand that the people in the House have to do that first, but if you uncap the House and you allow 100 new representatives in, most of the people outside of Congress, like you pointed out, think Congress is broken. And we've come to the understanding that that's really the crux of the issue. And if you want to get Congress working again, you have to hire different people, right? Like the people at this job, it's a corporation and they were a great corporation and they rose to the top, but they've become complacent. Everybody around them is adapting and moving up with the modern world and they're sitting still. And eventually another corporation is going to take over that leadership role if you don't adapt and grow. You have to modernize. You have to give people power. You have to continue expanding. And think about it again to the corporation model, right? If you have a whole bunch of great employees working at the bottom that built that country, that built that into something great, you have to share that power with them. You have to incentivize them to continue to want to do the job that they were doing. And uncapping the House provides some of those incentives, right? By sharing power with more people. It also changes some of the other incentives because by shrinking the districts, now the incentive is less about money and more about service, right? Because now you don't have to raise as much money to be in the office. So you don't have to cater to those special interests as much as you are now. So it creates an environment where the incentive structure is now changed and you can actually start to work on some of those other reforms that you need to work on because uncapping the House is not the only thing that needs to be done to fix what's going on, right? And you're never going to fix all the problems, but the best you can do is to identify the biggest problems. Let's work on that first, and then let's start chipping off the other ones afterwards.
It's kind of like in a person's personal life, I can imagine. Sometimes we are clueless. Why am I tired? Why am I out of energy? Why am I this or that? Is it because I don't get enough sleep or this, that, or the other? And it may be that you just don't know until you try little things that you know are good for you. And eventually you might find that keystone habit that, oh, turns out that unraveled everything else. And I say that in effect because I'm wondering if, much like the notion of uncapping the House, I've heard it said if you wanted to fix immigration in the United States or healthcare in the United States or pick your issue, any other number of issues. Sometimes the cynical response is, well, the best thing to do is not start from here. it's sort of, yeah, I have all sorts of theories of how we could get better, but we're stuck kind of where we're at. And so, and I'm not saying that these are unsolvable problems, but it would almost necessarily include some sort of a slow, gradual reform with a targeted direction in mind and the willingness and ability to pivot as time allows. And so I'm just curious if you had your druthers, the United States, because I don't know, maybe the idea is, look, if we could tomorrow blow the cap off and there's now 4,000 members in the House, that'd be great. Or is the general notion we would have to find ways to do this slow and deliberate, and if so, what is the criteria, the mechanisms that we would gauge to determine what step 2 is after we've accomplished step 1?
So this, you kind of brought up, well, like, what's your political ideology, right? And you're gonna find that out in my answer right now. And because my method is slow and deliberate, right? And I feel like that's a more conservative method. I think dramatic change creates more problems than it solves. So if you're a purist of the of representation, you probably want to go all the way back to the founding. You want to go 1 in 30,000. If we went from where we are now to 1 in 30,000, that would create a mess, and it would not be good for us.
What would that number
I
be, by the way?
I don't know off the top of my head. I can't do that math, and I don't remember.
I guess so. It would be 330 million divided by 30,000. Is that what it is?
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead. I didn't mean
Okay,
to break your stride.
and so you have to find a number that is palatable to the American people, that they can understand, and that is palatable to the people in charge, that they can manage, right? And then you have to build from there, right? Step 1 is repeal the Apportionment Act. Get rid of it. So now we have to apportion new representatives every 10 years. You have to write a new representation ratio, and you're going to have to write that in 2030 when you repeal the act and you write that new apportionment. And that should be a moderate increase. And then in 10 more years, you're going to need to moderately increase it again. And you're going to learn things from the first increase that will affect the second increase, right? But you need to be working in that direction. Sorry, I think I'm done there, actually.
No, that's. I was just going to say it's 11,000 people. That seems a bit much, but maybe working toward it.
Madison, there's a great quote. I can't remember which Federalist. I think it's Federalist 10, where he's basically like, you have to raise the number so you can avoid against the cabals of a few, and make sure it's not too high to avoid against the confusion of the multitude, right? So you have, again, everything is about balance, right? Like, and that's the whole, like, conservative progressive. I mean, the hardcore conservatives never want to change anything. The hardcore progressives want to change everything. And the reality is some things should stay the same and some things need to change sometimes. And you have to find the balance between that. That's the whole point of our divided, separated, and layered republic, is to be able to find a balance between all of those different interests.
So let me ask then, and let's just presume we have an appetite for reform in this country, and we
We
take
do, by the way. We absolutely have an appetite for
right.
reform. Let's acknowledge that that's real already. Let's
Stipulated. Yes, that is entirely fair. Let me revise that statement. Let's assume we have a concerted effort to work against our learned helplessness, that is stymieing some reform efforts, say. And we do, in fact, take step 1 of, whatever that, I'll call it, modest movement in this direction is. It would seem to me that in absence of something fairly drastic changing in our politics, what is necessarily going to stymie things in the near future is when it's time to do step 2. There are going to be a lot of people with good faith saying, okay, what did we learn from step 1 and how do we increase this and what should the number be and where should it all be? But there are going to be an awful lot of people saying, when we did it that way, we gave red states more power. Maybe we could do it this way now. So how do you get Americans to operate in good faith, knowing that anytime we do anything that's tinkering with representation, in the back of somebody's mind, they're trying to figure out how to game the system so that their party wins?
So you bring up the best point. That is literally what everybody always says, right? Like that's the biggest, like, argument against uncapping the House is, well, the other guy will have more power than me then. And it's like, the first thing you need to throw away is, if you're thinking about that, you've lost the point of representation. It's not their power, it's your power. Okay. And if you've already given it to them, then you're the one that's lost. You have to get past that. Right. And so, like, and the second part is, if you're going to step into that partisan lens, right, which all of us have a partisan swing, we all have interests that we believe in. Like I've just mentioned, I'm a conservative. I'm going to fight for a more conservative method. The question is, do you really believe in what you're fighting for? Do you really believe in the change that you're trying to make? Or are you deeply insecure about your ideas and you think that they're going to win? Right. And it's like, if you believe in what you're fighting for and you believe that you can articulate an argument to bring people to your side of the argument, then what do you care? Who cares if it's red or blue? Like, the idea is not red or blue. It's only captivated by red or blue. And it's your job to get it captivated by more than, to get enough votes, whether they're red or blue. You can do it. Like, we've seen it over and over again in American history where ideas get bipartisan support and real change happens. The civil rights movement, right? Like, that was a great example of how Congress worked, right? And there's a great book on this called Why Congress by Philip Wallach, and he details how it worked during the civil rights legislation and the fact that all of the different interests, even the white supremacists, they got to stand in Congress and speak their beliefs about it. And they lost. And they accepted their loss because they got a chance to speak their mind about it, right? And they had realized that the country was against them and that they had lost the argument and they decided to move on. And ultimately is like, that's how we gotta function. We gotta just be like, all right, I believe in what I'm gonna do. I don't care what the party apparatus is gonna do. I don't care if it's gonna benefit red or blue, because I know I can make my argument. I'm secure in what I'm doing and I believe in this.
I think that and look, Jeff, I completely agree with you. I think, though, that requires a certain amount of maturity that sometimes the people as a whole are lacking. And I say that because I'll take as an example the whole argument about abolishing the Electoral College. Now, there's good points and bad points for pro or anti-electoral college. I'm not trying to get into all that. But what's interesting is oftentimes I will hear it expressed in terms of, if the Electoral College did not exist, here these specific elections would have gone this way for these presidential candidates. And that's true in a moment of time. The problem is it presumes that we humans wouldn't find a way to shift, right? If it's all of a sudden up to the majority population who becomes president, then the way people run for office, where they campaign, how they campaign, the messages they get out, the way the parties are structured is all going to change for that reality. And I think sometimes what's underlying a lot of these concerns about reform is a presumption that the system is rigged, right? Those who advocate the most to get rid of the Electoral College presume that it is necessarily distorting the actual true will of the people. And a lot of people, I think, would presume that, any reforms at trying to change the House is, yeah, but then the real people who are in charge, no matter what we do, they're really going to get their way. And so we kind of have to put our thumb on the scale because we represent the people, whereas they represent the special interests. And I think it's almost as if, I shouldn't say it's almost as if, I believe self-government necessitates a certain amount of maturity, a certain amount of national cohesiveness, a certain amount of small r Republican virtues, and that there is no... there are obviously systems that are more conducive to that are better conducive to liberty, just as there are some systems that you can't have liberty in. But ultimately, if the soul of the nation's broken, you can't really institute these reforms without addressing the more hard issue first.
So I'm going to go a roundabout way to answer this question. So follow me here. So my other endeavor that I do is something called politics and parenting. And I think that they're the same thing, right? It's like, if you're a parent, like I mentioned the wife metaphor, right? You got to be able to communicate with a partner. As your children grow, you got to be able to adapt them and share power with them so you can grow your household, right? Like, I've got 5 kids. That means that my teenagers are doing responsible chores around the house to help out with mom and dad so we can continue to get things done. Now, you think about what it is to be a parent. You set rules, you set boundaries, you educate your child, you share responsibility with them, you balance the different interests. You got 5 kids and you got to go to the movies. Like, not everybody's going to be able to go to the movie they want to get to. You have to be able to find compromise in there so everybody can do everything. And then at the end of the day, you have to hold everybody accountable, including yourself. And you have to share power so your children and your wife or your partner, whichever side you're on, can also hold you accountable, right? And so I think that, going back to the learned helplessness, the people in charge are kind of stuck in this learned helplessness that they don't feel like the American people are mature enough to handle this responsibility. And I think that it goes back to that Wilsonia era where the government started to take control and they started to say, well, can't the trash man do it? The trash man can. right? And they started, it's entitlement. So if you're a family and you indulge your children too much, when it comes to doing chores, it might be difficult. I never had to do chores before. I've always been able to do whatever I want. I've always been able to get whatever I want. Well, the bank account's closed. You got to work for it now. You got to pay for your own way. I don't want to do that. That's hard, right? And I think that's where we're at. We've entitled a lot of Americans to think that, but I think we're actually over the crest of that. I think a lot of people have gotten that we're entitled, including myself. Like I feel like my generation is very entitled, the 1990s generation. Like we're spoiled, right? Like I'm reading a book about Mao, right? And I'm reading about people in China and like what they went through during the Cultural Revolution and what their lives were like. And I'm like, man, I have complained about my life and I feel bad because my life is good. I am spoiled, at the end of the day. And I'm complaining about all the people in charge not doing the right thing. But like at the end of the day, for most of my life, I didn't do anything to help. I didn't try. I wasn't a good citizen, right? And it's like we have to, I think we're over the crux. We're parents. The government has been parents that have entitled their children. They've said, "Hey, don't worry about it. I got you. I got your back." And now we have a generation of people that have been in charge that are passing away, and there's nobody to pass the baton to because they don't trust us because they feel like we're entitled little brats and we aren't mature enough to do it. But what I'll say is, give us a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Just give us a chance. We've learned. We've watched you. We've watched the mistakes that you've made. We've reflected on ourselves. We see what the entitlement did to us and how it shaped us as people, and we've tried to change. I don't, I have a personal thing here. My father-in-law is in the hospital. He's got stage 4 pancreatic cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He's not going to live very long. And I was down with him yesterday, and I was talking to him, and we've had a point of contention in our relationship. He spoils my kids and it drives me nuts, right? Every time I come over there and we got to speak alone and he looked me in the eye and he took my hand and he said, "Jeff," he goes, "one of my biggest regrets," or not, he didn't say regret, but he said, "One of the things I would do different, or one of the things I think I did wrong is I spoiled my kids and my grandkids too much. I feel like I entitled them, and if I could go back and do it over again, I think I would do less of that." And I was like, "Man, I really appreciate that. I appreciate that you shared that with me because that's a contention that we've had." And I felt like that as a person. I wish my parents wouldn't have maybe spoiled me as much. I wish I would have done more work as a kid, so I would have been more prepared as an adult. But I learned from that, right? And that generation, they can look past the fact that they made a mistake and they entitled us, and they can go, "Hey, you know what? Let's talk about this. We did this to you, and you don't want to do this work because we told you didn't have to. But the reality is, this is your job, and we need to start to offload our responsibility onto you because we're not going to be around any longer."
I think a mark of a true conservative, a true, I'll say, Burkean, Tocquevillian conservative, is they look at the generations they're not a part of with the same way a loving parent looks at their child, right? They don't, or to put it this way, I've heard it, and sometimes we do this with the United States. Sometimes when we're younger, we look at the United States as it could do no wrong. Then we get to our teenage years where the United States was a complete basket of evil. And then hopefully most of us will eventually mature into recognizing it's a fallible thing. Generations are fallible. They make mistakes. They do some amazing things. They do some terrible things. But that does not mean I can't hold genuine love and respect and regard and admiration. And I think that's important because there is it's a balance there, right? There's my temptation as a millennial is if I'm not on Wilson or Rousseau, it's to blame the boomers for a lot of stuff. And I say that tongue in cheek because it's fun, because there are parents in some regards or grandparents and they saw the world very different. They grew up in the fully analog world. We kind of got our feet in both the analog and the digital, so culturally there's a lot of ways in which we just don't get each other sometimes. And we did, I think, receive the front end of that. Everyone gets an award. Everyone gets recognized. Everyone is entitled. And we did receive the front end of the growing up in the era where parents weren't, in intact marriages. And it's not always good or bad, because I think sometimes the millennial response to that is, okay, good, I'll just never get married. Or divorce rates are really low, but that's because our marriage rates are terrible. And so I think a generation almost always rightly figures out what the last one got wrong and then tries to counter. And again, I'm speaking like a true millennial because forget Gen X even exists half the time. My apologies to all my many Gen X friends. It's just my natural habit. But I also recognize that we millennials are old enough that it's probably high time we start to recognize the natural human tendency to do these very things that drive us nuts in the older generation. And one of those things is, I think we just miss the ways in which younger Americans maybe have a capacity to be more innovative and resilient to the cultural and political attacks coming at us in effect. And I want to ask you this directly, especially with your podcast, Politics and Parenting. I don't talk about parenting a lot on this podcast for the younger generation, but what do you see there as just broadly speaking, the resiliency of the coming up generation? What are your main concerns for them? And are there ways in which you think people of our age, I wouldn't say are inappropriately concerned, but maybe don't vest enough hope and genuine expectation into younger Americans?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And before I answer that real quickly, I just want to give background to like where does the entitlement come from? And you look at my father-in-law and you look at his life and where he came from. He grew up in Michigan. I mean, they weren't well off, right? Like they didn't have a lot of money. Life was hard. He had a very hard life. He was paralyzed. He at 16 years old, he was in a wheelchair and he worked his way up to through the government as a GS-15 working in cybersecurity, right?
Oh,
Like
wow.
he worked as he and he provided for his family, right? And all the things that he didn't have growing up, he wanted to give his kids. And that's something I think that every parent wants to do, and I think the struggle is understanding what to give them and what not to give them, what to make them work for and what not to. And finding that balance is difficult, and it's understandable that maybe an entire generation might get it wrong, right? Because we're all kind of copying the people around us, right? It's keeping up with the Joneses. And if they got it, then I got to do it. And then your kid comes back to you with the same argument and you love your kid and your kid kind of uses that love against you to manipulate you into doing the thing that they want you to do. And like as a parent, you got to be strong not to do that, but at the same time, you got to forgive yourself because you're going to do that thing, right? And it's like it's the same thing. It's like we just got to forgive the fact that it happened and just start moving on and fixing it. And then to the next generation, that's how we fix it, right? It's like we my generation, I think a lot of us have struggled in our personal relationships or maybe our jobs because we were entitled and life has been a little bit harder than we didn't prepare ourselves well enough because we weren't forced to prepare ourselves. And the next generation is preparing themselves, but they need help. They need guidance, right? It can't just come from everywhere else. I think that our generation's job is to pour into that generation, and that generation is smart. Like I have 2 15-year-old kids that would run circles around, somebody in their 30s, and they know so much more than I do about so much other stuff, right? And it's like, it's sharing. Like when you're young, you're learning all the new things. When you're old, you've maybe perfected or mastered some of the old things. And our job is to push that wisdom into them so they can be wise earlier and accomplish more. And I think our tendency is to withhold power from them because we're afraid of what they're going to do. But if we're pouring into them and we're shaping them to be the best versions of themselves, then we shouldn't be worried about that.
Well said. There are other directions I could go, but I'd be hard pressed to come up with a better capstone, I guess, to this conversation. So I think I'm going to close there, other than giving you an opportunity, of course, to share with the listener if they want to get involved with No Cap Fund, or if they want to listen to your various podcast endeavors, especially politics and parenting. Where do people go to find out more about you, and where do they go to get involved in these things you're passionate about?
So if you want to find out about me, you can go to politicsandparenting.com. That's my personal Substack. I write about parenting, I write about politics, and I write a lot about representation. If you want to get involved in representation, you want to learn more about representation, you can go to y435.org or nocapfund.org. You can read about why we have the capped house, different reasons of why we need to uncap the house, and you can read our declaration for representation. You can sign that. You can get involved by signing the document. You can donate. We're a 501c4. We're one of those people that are trying to be an interest, right? We're trying to interest the people, and so you can donate to the organization. You can sign up to volunteer for the organization. At the end of the day, the smallest thing you can do is to go to the website, sign the declaration, and then make a plan to educate yourself. Cut out one little thing. cut out one fantasy football league, maybe not do flag football this year. What a hobby, whatever it is, just one, just small time. Take the time per week that you would have given to that hobby to become an expert and learn about representation, and then just talk about it. If you start talking about it, if you start sharing about it, it'll pick up steam.
Jeff, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to come on Saving Elephants.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.